Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that, Gabby. I'd like to start off by introducing Scott Secord. He's a Provincial Mining Specialist with the MLI Immigration Training and Skills Development. And then also myself, Keith Birnie. I'm an Industrial Hygiene and Ventilation Specialist with Workplace Safety North. Scott will be talking more about the legal compliance issues, enforcement, what inspectors will be looking for. And myself, I'll be talking a little bit about education and prevention. So about Workplace Safety North. Workplace Safety North is one of our 4 sector-based health and safety associations in Ontario, and the only one headquartered in the North. WSN provides province-wide government-approved workplace health and safety services for mining and forest product sectors, as well as for business and communities across Northern Ontario. With health and safety specialists located across the province, WSN and its legacy organizations have been helping make Ontario workplaces safer for more than 100 years. For more information, please visit workplacesafetynorth.ca. So today we're going to talk, we're going to go through a bit of an introduction about the initiative, which is on occupational disease. What is its focus and its importance? And what the MLITSD health and safety inspectors will be looking for during a healthy workplace initiative focus on occupational disease. There'll be some discussion on pertinent legislation, as well as some resources from both the MLITSD and WSN. And then at the end, we'll finish off with a question and answer period.
Good morning. Thank you, Keith. So just a quick disclaimer before we begin, that the purpose of today's presentation is to assist workplace parties in understanding their obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. It is not intended to replace the Occupational Health and Safety Act or the regulations, and reference should always be made to the official versions of the legislation. It is always the responsibility of workplace parties to ensure compliance with the legislation, and this presentation does not constitute legal advice. If you require assistance with respect to the interpretation of the legislation and its potential application in specific circumstances, please contact your legal counsel. The Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development inspectors will apply and enforce the Act and its regulations based on the facts as they may find them in the workplace. This presentation does not affect their enforcement discretion in any way. So this Healthy Workers and Healthy Workplace initiative is actually a cross-platform initiative taking place in all sectors: construction, healthcare, industrial, and mining. It's broken up into 2 phases. The first phase being education and outreach between October 3rd and December 30th, including this presentation that you're watching today, as well as the actual inspection blitz, which will take place between October 31st to December 30th, 2022. And if you need more information about these initiatives, you can click on the link below when you receive the presentation. So why is the MLITSD conducting this type of initiative? Well, the important factor is that 87% of all fatalities within the Ontario mining sector are caused by fatal occupational disease. Between 2011 and 2021, 179 workers were reported as having died as a result of an occupational disease in the mining sector. The Mining Health and Safety Review, which was done in 2015, also identified occupational disease, particularly those related to airborne hazards, as one of the 5 key issues that pose the greatest risk to worker safety. In addition, the MLITSD is conducting this initiative to help raise awareness of employers, supervisors, and workers about occupational disease so that they have a better understanding of the risks associated with the exposure to chemical, biological, and physical agents, and the use of proper controls to reduce or eliminate the hazards. Additionally, we want to raise awareness of the importance of controlling airborne hazards such as diesel particulate matter, silica, radon, and other health hazards in mines and mining plants. We also want to promote healthier workplaces through baseline and routine testing, and control airborne hazards in mines and mining plants. We want to make sure that workplace parties are in compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its applicable regulations. So what can you expect during an inspection? Well, as you may be aware, that a ministry inspector can enter in or upon any workplace at any time without warrant or notice. When a ministry inspector arrives at a workplace, they will always introduce themselves, they will explain the reason for the visit, and ask to have a worker and management representative accompany them during the inspection. The ministry inspector may conduct an administrative review and a physical inspection of the workplace. Ministry inspectors will enforce the Act and the regs on the facts observed in the workplace at the time of the visit. The ministry inspector will always leave a field visit report, which will include the reason for the visit, any details of any findings, and any corrective compliance measures if required.
Okay. So the following slides show the alarming trend around occupational disease. So as Scott noted previously, 80% of all fatalities within the Ontario mining sector are caused by fatal occupational diseases. So between 2011 and 2021, 179 workers died as a result of occupational disease. If you look at the chart below, you see that the pie, it's a lot of fatalities are due to fatal diseases as compared to the traumatics. So if you look at a ratio roughly year by year, it's about 10 to 1. So that's really significant. And, you know, we often don't put the energy that it deserves into occupational disease, but we need to start looking at it and taking it more seriously. Unfortunately, we don't see these fatalities show up until years later because there's a lot of latency and you may be exposed to things early on today. And then the symptoms don't show up till later on in life. And it shows up as cancer, noise-induced hearing loss, lung disease, and most of these things they have no cure, so they're fatal. So this shows this alarming trend. And if you can move on to the next slide. So and this kind of makes sense to me when I look at this, you know, 61% of occupational disease fatalities occurred among people that are 65 years and older. And that makes sense, again, if you look at the long latency between the onset of exposure and then when symptoms develop. It's later in life that people start to develop these diseases. And that's why you see that the majority of the population is 65 years and older that have these. Next. Okay, so again, mining, you know, mining is quite the industry and it's fairly hazardous to start off with. So it's not surprising that mining is up there. Steel as well, followed by construction, pulp and paper, lots of chemicals in pulp and paper industry, forestry, automotive. So yeah, you see that mining, you know, pretty much the trend that you can see here is it kind of pretty much leads the way, essentially, in terms of all industries. Okay, so the top occupational disease death causal agents are really asbestos and silica. Even though asbestos is essentially banned, it's still prevalent in many buildings. You still see asbestos in boilers and pipes. It was very cheap. It provides great insulating properties. Usually with asbestos, though, if you don't touch it, it's okay. But usually once you touch it, it then leads to, you know, you can end up with different types of diseases like mesothelioma and lung cancers. And then silica, it's everywhere. You know, pretty much everything has silica in it. So you still see a lot of disease associated with silica. Now, aluminum powder is interesting. So that's been more of a recently accepted claim. Remember the McIntyre powder, we'd coat our lungs to actually prevent silicosis. And now that's showing up as disease with Parkinson's. And so it's good that that's getting traction with WSIB. And then there's other things too that you see, the diesel exhaust up there, ionizing radiation, nickel, and for the most part, these things cause a type of cancer. Okay, so the top 5 disease claims are malignant neoplasm of trachea, bronchus, and lungs. So that's just a fancy way of saying the onset of cancer. So you see a lot of lung cancers out there, chronic airway obstruction, neoplasm of pleura, again, cancers, silicosis, paralysis antigens like primary Parkinson's, so from aluminum powder. Next. So the non-fatal disease claims are noise-induced hearing loss, and that's not surprising. Noise is everywhere, so whether you're getting it from occupational or non-occupational, and we just gradually lose our hearing with time. So we see a lot. It's not surprising that 60% of WSI claims are associated with noise-induced hearing loss. Also, a lot to do with hand-arm vibration, especially in the mining industry. We still use, you know, jackleg drills, stopers, even platforms on, you know, on scissor decks. You get white feet. So a lot of hand-arm vibration issues, whole body vibration. Viral, I mean, we came out of a pandemic here, COVID-19, and as well as there's many other viruses and bacteria in underground or in surface. And Raynaud's disease is also kind of like a subset of the hand-arm vibration. It's really, Raynaud's disease is just the more formal term for white hand or white finger. And then other things, exposures to other chemical agents. Okay. So this just breaks down between the type. So, you know, you can either have acute health effects, you can have chronic health effects, you can have long latency. And then noise is so prevalent that it has a green bar all on its own and then something else not coded. So there's a lot of acute exposures. So which acute exposures, you know, it's things that happen right away, like CO poisoning or you know, even exposure to high levels of dust. Then you have chronic, you know, it takes time for the disease to develop. And long latency is kind of really also a subset of chronic. We're talking mostly cancers when we talk long latency illnesses. And then again, as I noted, the larger portion of the bar there is noise-induced hearing loss. Okay, so an industrial hygiene program. So industrial hygiene is really the art and science of anticipation, recognition, assessment, and control. We want to assess, and really this shares the same facets as other health hazards or other safety hazards. You want to identify your hazards, you want to assess, measure the size of them, and then you want to put controls in place. And it doesn't stop there. If you want a proper program, you want to put, you know, compliance to controls and auditing. So, you know, you want to audit to make sure your controls are in place. You know, record keeping, whether that's about exposures or medical, ensure that you're complying with legislation, which Scott will talk more about. You want to conduct your inspections, and then specifically more for designated substances, Regulation 490. There's, you know, we have 11 designated substances in the province, and they all have their own kind of code for medical, and you want to follow that. Communications paramount, and training supervisors and workers about the health effects. And, you know, the mining review identified, you know, OC disease or in particular respiratory hazards as one of the top 5 hazards. And it identified that supervisors and workers do need more training around this. You want to implement policies and procedures in place. And again, you're just going to follow this loop around. So that's, you know, your typical industrial hygiene program. Okay. Okay. So we have different health hazards as opposed to safety hazards, which are like pinch points, crush points. But in occupational hygiene, we like to classify things into different categories. And the reason why we classify things is because they're assessed and measured and controlled differently. And that's why we have chemical, physical, biological. So with the chemical world, we're talking about solids, liquids, gas, vapors, mist, dust, fumes, fibers, all of that. And it could be, there's basically 4 routes of entry into the body. There's inhalation, so respiratory, skin absorption, ingestion, and injection. We're focusing more on respiratory today because inhalation is by far the most efficient way for chemicals to enter your body. Dermal still out there, right? We're exposed to greases, solvents, and then we get skin rashes or, you know, other types of occupational disease associated with the skin. Now, physical will include things like your noise, radiation, and from a mining environment, we're probably talking more about radon gas, which then disintegrates further into a particle, and we inhale that into our body, and that causes cancer. And then we have vibration and temperature. And temperature, with global warming, we're starting to see, you know, it's starting to become a little more energy put around temperature or thermal stress. Biological is anything really that comes from something living. So you got bacteria, viruses, fungi, any other living organism that can cause acute or chronic infections. So under the chemical world, and maybe specifically things you might see in a mining environment, and when we talk mining, we're not just talking underground, we also have surface plants, lots of chemicals and smelters and mills. But if we talk about dust and fibers, we're going to see silica, nickel, gypsum, asbestos, you know, fumes, you know, it could be diesel, welding, and blasting. Probably welding is the most common thing associated with fumes. Gases, you usually have after blasts, diesel emissions, and strata. You know, methane sometimes is just captured in the strata. You might have re-entry protocols, you know, diesel emissions control program, all of those things. Mist, fogs, and vapors, fuels and solvents, smoke, after blast, poorly maintained diesel equipment, and diesel particulate. I know there's a lot of energy right now around going to battery electric. but diesel is here to stay for a while. And as of 2012, diesel is a known carcinogen, in particular the particulate matter. Physical, so noise. Noise is everywhere, as I noted earlier. You want to make sure you have a program in place, and our regulation actually encourages using the hierarchy of controls for noise and not just relying on hearing protectors. Radiation, as I noted earlier, we're going to see mostly the radon gas in uranium and non-uranium mines. And that's a function of the geology at the plant. But also there's radiations in mills and smelters as well. You have the gauges and things like that. Vibration, hand arm vibration, foot vibration, whole body, and then thermal stress. Biological, COVID-19 would be one that we're very familiar with. You got viruses, bacteria, fungus, and that's why we have clean and dirty dries. You have to watch with showers at the mines, and bites, stings, and toxins, and allergy and sensitization. So we do have mold underground as well that we've seen. Okay, some examples of key occupational health hazards that can be found in the workplace. So I noted some earlier, but the blasting gases, usually you end up seeing carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, oxides, and nitrogen. Those are some of your main off gases that you get. And depending what you blast in, if you're in a sulfide ore body, you might get sulfur dioxide. If you're blasting ANFO and cement, you're going to get ammonia. We're also going to see diesel emissions, both a gas and a particulate phase. We will do air sampling underground for both phases. The dust is everywhere. You can't get away from it. Anytime there's drilling, mucking, rock breaking, all of those things generate dust. Metals, sulfur dioxide, dust from refining, and fumes, welding fumes, or even molten metal. That will also create fumes as well. And to continue on, we have hazardous chemicals, so cleaning agents, but also all the solvents and grease and all the other types of things that you have in the workplace that could create skin issues mostly, as well as inhalation problems. We have 11 designated substances in the province of Ontario, and some of the more common you might see in a mine would be asbestos, isocyanates, lead, silica. You're going to see isocyanates maybe in some of your ground support. You're going to see asbestos because it's probably a legacy issue. Even some asbestos shows up in gold stringers in mines. And of course, silica, if you're in a gold mine, or in most mines, or most things have silica in it, and then radon. So radon, you know, the mining legislation is clear about, you know, having to go out and measure it at certain frequencies depending on the concentrations measured.
So this initiative will focus really on these 5 key elements: ventilation systems, diesel exhaust, mine exposure, designated substances, and WHMIS. For ventilation systems, inspectors will check to make sure that mines are compliant with the ventilation requirements set out in Regulation 854. This will have a key focus on where diesel-powered equipment is operating underground, in headings with auxiliary ventilation. It will check to ensure that ventilation systems dilute and remove airborne contaminants below prescribed limits, that there are records plans available of the ventilation system. For diesel exhaust, inspectors will check that diesel equipment is being properly maintained, including that required diesel emission testing is being performed. For mine exposures, inspectors will check that exposure sampling and monitoring, including personal sampling, is completed in areas of known or expected exposures. Inspectors will check that assessments and control programs are in place where required and have been developed in consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee or Worker Health and Safety representative. For designated substances, inspectors will check that the designated substance control programs are in place and operating as designed. For designated substances such as arsenic, asbestos, isocyanates, or other reagents. And for WHMIS, inspectors will check that employee training and hazardous storage and material handling practices are in place. Inspectors will check for the completion of risk assessments, especially in areas where there are processes or increases in production that may affect the assessments that have been done, and so that where reassessments may be required. Inspectors will check that adequate ventilation underground mines are eliminated to reduce exposure to airborne hazards, and that workers are wearing prescribed PPE specific for the tasks that they're performing. They want to make sure that workers are trained to recognize occupational disease hazards and can select care and use the right PPE as prescribed. We're going to be checking that employers are following the WHMIS 2015 program, including proper labeling and worker education, and that workers have been trained in their appropriate measures and procedures for the safe handling of hazardous chemicals, including disposal and managing of spills. Inspectors will check that control programs are operating as prescribed, including engineering controls, work practices, hygiene facilities, that there are methods and procedures to monitor airborne concentrations and worker exposure, and that worker and supervisors training, as well as medical surveillance programs, are in effect. The inspectors will also ensure that employers are sampling workers who may be at risk of exposure. And they'll check to make sure things like, does the sampling program match what's dictated in the control program? How many occupations are part of the program? Looking at the similar exposure groups. What is the frequency of the personal and area sampling? Is there any areas of activities during work sampling, making sure that the workers are actually being sampled while they're doing the actual work? Does the program include provisions for what happens if limits are exceeded? And are there other substances, in addition to the designated substances that are being sampled, such as nitrogen dioxide or carbon monoxide, cyanide, SO2, that need to be addressed?
Okay. Thanks, Scott. So under Regulation 490, so a designated substance control program should aim to include the following. So first of all, you need to assess for designated substance in the workplace. And then it says if the health of the worker may be effective, you may need to put a control program into place. So first of all, start with your assessment and then use the methods and procedures for monitoring and determining the concentration, including personal exposure records. Again, put a training program in place, and the regulation does call for that, having a training program for supervisors and worker on the health effects and the measures and procedures required under the control program. Medical surveillance will be required. Roles and responsibilities of the different workplace parties to carry out your control program, and different control measures. Again, you want to start with the hierarchy of controls, including and then maybe engineering controls, work practices, hygiene facilities, personal protective equipment such as respirators in order to limit a person's exposure.
So inspectors will be enforcing the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations as part of this initiative. Under the Act, Sections 25, 26, 27, and 28 set out the general duties of employers, supervisors, and working, including provisions for providing information and the use of personal protective equipment. Under Regulation 854 for mines and mining plants, one of the key focus areas for inspectors will be Sections 5.1 through 5.3, which requires all employers to conduct risk assessments of the workplace for the purpose of identifying, assessing, and managing hazards and potential hazards that may expose a worker to injury or illness. Under these provisions, an employer must develop and maintain, in consultation with the JHSC, measures to eliminate where practical or control where the elimination is impractical, the hazards and potential hazards identified in the risk assessment. And this will be associated with the agents that contribute towards occupational disease. Once hazards are identified, workplaces need to determine the appropriate controls using the hierarchy controls to prevent or mitigate risks associated with the hazards. Controls can be procedures, physical equipment, or objects or systems. And Keith will speak a little bit more about that now.
Okay, so here's your typical model for hierarchy of controls. And I mean, whether you're dealing with safety hazards or health hazards, we're focused today obviously mostly on health hazards. But you want to follow the hierarchy where possible, of course. And you're just going to start with elimination if you can substitute. So elimination, a good example is if in the context of diesel particulate, if I go to battery electric, I've eliminated that particular hazard. Substitution, I may use a less toxic substance as compared to something else. And sometimes that falls into place with different chemicals. Engineering, usually you're talking about ventilation type controls or isolation or booths or things like that. Administrative controls are just changing the way I work with something. So administrative, a good example of that would be, say, idling policies outside your building. So you don't want diesel equipment idling unnecessarily. And then also like a really good example when it comes to thermal stress would be work rest regimes. Those would be administrative controls. And then the last and the least effective is PPE. And it's not as effective because you haven't done anything really with the hazard. You're just actually using something to protect you against the hazard. The biggest thing I can say about personal protective equipment, especially in the context of health hazards, is it has to be the right PPE for the type of hazard and the size of the hazard, or we'll say concentration of the hazard. And that really comes into play when you're talking about things like respiratory hazards or earplugs for noise-induced hearing loss. You know, start off with an assessment, see what kind of noise levels you have, and then pick the appropriate personal protective equipment. So the other way to look at all of this is, you know, at the source, which may be typically elimination substitution type controls. And then along the pathway, you're going to deal mostly with your engineering type controls and sometimes a little bit of administrative in there as well. When you get to the worker, you're usually using administrative and personal protective type of controls. And you can see here, of course, if I can deal with the hazard right at the source, that's going to be a lot more effective than waiting until the hazard shows up to the worker and now I have to deal with it in a different way.
So in addition to the risk assessment sections, Regulation 854 and mining plants, inspectors will be checking out these following segments. So Section 12 sets out the requirements for the use of personal protective equipment. Section 182 sets out that diesel-powered equipment used underground shall not be used unless there's a form submitted to the ministry first, and that undiluted exhaust emissions contain less than 600 ppm of carbon monoxide. Section 183 requires employers to maintain records and charts of and procedures relating to the ventilation where diesel-powered equipment is operating. Section 183.1 sets out the minimum airflow requirements where diesel-powered equipment is operating. And then it goes further to reduce the concentrations of toxic substances to prevent exposures of workers to levels in excess under the prescribed limits of Section 4 of Regulation 833. Sections 183.15 prescribes the limits for total carbon and elemental carbon. Sections 183.2 sets out the requirements for testing of the volume of air flowing and quality of air in mines, and testing of undiluted exhaust from diesel-powered equipment. Continuing on, Sections 252 sets out the requirements for ventilations in mining plant buildings. 253 sets out the underground ventilation system requirements. Sections 254 and 255 sets out the requirements for auxiliary ventilation and non-ventilated areas. 257 and 258 sets out the requirements for using water for dust control in an underground mine. Section 266 requires that dust or other material that is likely to cause a hazard by becoming airborne and should be removed with minimum delay. Sections 267 through 269 include requirements for annual surveys, assessments, and monitoring of hazardous elements and compounds, chemical records, and records of injury. Section 286 sets out the requirements for makeup air supply and recirculated air. And 287 through 293 includes requirements to monitor and manage radon emissions. In addition to the Act and Regulation 54, inspectors, when they visit your workplace, will also be checking these other regulations. So checking for compliance in these other regulations, And so Regulation 833 sets out the exposure limits for chemical and biological agents. Regulation 490 sets out the designated substance programs and the requirements for designated substance control programs and worker information and training. Regulation 860 is the WHMIS regulation, which sets out the requirements for labeling, data sheet management, worker training, safe handling practices and procedures. Regulation 381 sets out the requirements for noise protection and to protect workers from hazardous sound levels. And Regulation 420 sets out the requirements for providing written notice of occupational illness. The MLITSD has provided some amazing resources that are available on ontario.ca for workplace parties to understand and support compliance to the Occupational Act and its regulations. Included in your minute package will be these links to these documents. On the left-hand side, you'll see links to the actual legislation through e-laws, as well as the Mining Health and Safety Prevention Review. And on the right-hand side, you'll see guidelines that have been produced by the ministry to support compliance with the legislation. So you'll see we have a guideline for Occupational Health and Safety Act, a guideline for risk assessment and risk management, for sampling diesel particulate matter in mines, for testing undiluted exhaust underground mines, for post-blast gas examinations in mines, for current occupational exposure limits with under 833, for the noise regulation, for the WHMIS regulation, as well as a brand new one and an excellent resource for understanding designated substances in the workplace.
Okay, so WSN also has a lot of resources on its webpage. So the Mining Workplace Environment Checklist, it's about a 72-page booklet. It actually provides a good point-in-time snapshot of your industrial hygiene program. So whether you're dealing with designated substances or not, it's probably a good practice to have an industrial hygiene program, period, in your workplace. There's a very good short video on respiratory hazards in mining. Talk about the main respiratory type hazards that you might find underground, diesel emissions, radon, etc. There's some free training resources on diesel emission hazards for all industries, an infographic, and then also an infographic on respirators. There's an auxiliary ventilation ventilation manual. There was actually a 3-day course here last week. And there's actually a newer version now. It's version 2.1. This is showing version 1.6. So I'll probably update that before we send this out. So there's a brand new manual out there, and it offers very good practical applications around auxiliary vent in the mines. And then just WSN itself does radon assessments, ventilation assessments, and industrial hygiene consulting as well. Thanks. Okay, and then there's the Mining Common Core. So for frontline supervisors, we teach industrial hygiene and mine ventilation. That's part of the Supervisor Common Core program. And there's many, many other websites and good resources out there, like Prevent Oc Disease. That's not a WSN thing, but it's a good website. And just NIOSH as well. NIOSH produces a lot of great things, especially on dust. So they have a good booklet on dust control. And then ICMM, that they provide a lot of guidance around conducting risk assessment, and then they have stuff on health risk. So Scott talked earlier about doing risk assessment under 5.1 to 5.3 in the mining regs, but sometimes what we overlook is the health hazards, and we need to start looking at that more. And then various other hazard or resources that you see here, CCOHS for WHMIS and the different hazard categories, and then hierarchy of controls.
Okay, so thank you to our speakers, Keith and Scott. Now, before we move into audience questions, we would like to ask another set of questions to understand what you've learned today and to help us improve our webinars and future awareness initiatives. So I'm going to launch the poll, and you should be seeing the poll on your screen now. So please go ahead and answer these 15 questions. As with the previous survey, no identifying information will be collected or asked for, and all responses will be completely anonymous. WSN will be providing the ministry with the survey results, and the ministry will not receive any of your personal information. Your responses are confidential, and results will only be analyzed in aggregate form. This survey is completely voluntary and will not impact the likelihood of being inspected by a ministry health and safety inspector. While you're completing the poll, I will invite our speakers back on screen for any audience questions we've received. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions, so if you do have a question, please go ahead and put that in the chat box, and we'd be happy to answer your question. And since there aren't any questions, I will ask, Keith, Scott, do you have any thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I just want to address some of the chat questions, actually. So with more comments in the chat box. So if I wasn't clear about noise-induced hearing loss, yeah, it's a non-fatal. It's and if I wasn't clear on that, I apologize for that. But yeah, that's definitely a non-fatal type claim. And then the other question was, and I just caught it myself looking back, and the pie chart is flipped around. So we need to show that the majority of the pie is fatal diseases, as opposed to the fatal traumatic. So it's just between the bar colors and the chart colors, the little pie is just something that has to be fixed and reversed. So I could do that, Gabby, before we send this out. And then other than that, I just want to leave people with the fact that, occupational disease is pretty serious. And until you show the stats, you don't realize how bad it really is. Like I said, a ratio, roughly 10 to 1. Or 85 to 15%, whatever it is. But it's large and it's huge, and we often don't give it the attention it needs because nothing's affecting me today as much. So with time, it will affect you. I've seen many people affected, my grandfather included, who worked in the mines, who left with basically COPD, breathing in silica dust in the gold mines. So it does catch up to you, and I hope that people leave here today putting more of an energy. And there's also more tools coming out in the future to help people have more teeth around being able to have traction in the workplace around addressing occupational disease and the hazards.
Great, thanks, Keith. Anything from you, Scott?
Yeah, I just want to remind people that, inspectors are coming to their sites to check on these items that we've identified, and that, inspectors are your partners in compliance. And compliance is the best tool that we have to ensure that our workers are healthy and safe in the workplace. And so when inspectors come to your site, they are excited to be there and to support the operation in achieving their compliance goals. So we're really excited to be joining you guys on this journey together as we work to make sure Ontario is the safest mining jurisdiction in the world. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. So the poll is still running. Before we end the webinar, we'll let the webinar run so that anyone that hasn't had a chance to answer can do so. And in conclusion, I would just like to thank you for attending today's webinar regarding the Healthy Workers and Healthy Workplaces initiative on occupational disease. A copy of the presentation and the recording will be emailed to you within the next few business days and posted to the resources page of workplacesafetynorth.ca. So thank you again and have a safe day.
Thank you.
Thank you.